Hi. So I thought that I'll start a series where I make the all the subjects that are required for entrance exams easier for all of you. And I got many requests in the Telegram group that I should start with ethics. And I totally agree with that because personally, for me also, ethics has been like a tough topic to master. But all said and done, it's an important component of the exams, whether you are appearing for USMLEs or you are appearing for Canadian licensing exams. That includes QE1. So I just thought that I'll start with the series and I'll make like short videos on concepts of ethics that can help you guys master this topic, and it's no longer quite a fearful subject to master. So let's get ahead with it. um, First of all, I'll go ahead and discuss some of the resources that I used during the exam. And these resources were mainly Toronto notes. I cannot emphasize enough how beautifully they have written like the chapter of ethics, legal and organizational medicine in Toronto notes. I know it is tough to remember Toronto notes, and I have made a video how you can read Toronto notes effectively. So if you haven't seen that video, please check out the video I have already put on that. And then coming on to like, I remembered the concepts, but I needed like a question answer version. So for this, I used a book which is by Conrad Fisher, and the book is Medical Ethics for Boards. It's a set of like almost 100 questions, which is very, very helpful for you to understand like a practical scenario. So if you have time and you have finances, please invest in this book. It is available on Amazon and it's very well written. Another two resources that I used, which helped me assess where I stand on the topic of ethics, were UWorld, because it had questions, and this is the main question bank that I use for my preparation. And then I use like MCCQ assessment exams. So this also helped me get a hang of how questions are asked in a Canadian licensing exams when it comes to ethics. So these were my resources when I was preparing for ethics. So contents of this video, I wanted to take this slow, and I thought that I'll make like videos on one specific topic and then I'll combine it in series. So for this video in particular, we will be discussing everything about consent. I have gotten ahead and taken some things from CMPA. I've taken some resources from CPSO. I've taken stuff from Toronto Notes, and also I've had some like question answers which can help you understand to give a practical understanding of ethics. So starting ahead with ethical principles. The first principle is autonomy. How we define autonomy, it is usually expressed as a right of competent adults to make informed decisions about their own medical care. So everything is broken down into these highlighted words, which are competent adults, which means that a person should be sane, mentally competent to make informed decisions. That means every information, adverse effects, benefits, risks have been explained to the patient, and it's an informed decision about their own medical care. Now, say if a patient refuses the life saving treatment or surgery, as a doctor, it is your responsibility to explain the patient what this surgery could mean for them. You have to not only explain like, okay, I'm doing this surgery, it'll help you, breathe better, or say digest better or live better. You have to explain everything about that surgery, which includes the risks of doing the surgery, which includes the benefits of the surgery, the risk of undergoing the anesthesia, everything. So you discuss or counsel the patient about the consequences, right? And now the patient is mentally competent. He does have the ability to make decisions, but still the patient refuses to go ahead with the surgery. As a doctor, you feel that a patient should undergo the surgery. The patient understands that this is the surgery, these are the risks, these are the benefits, but still the patient refuses the surgery. The first thing as a doctor you have to do is, we are not judging that, why did he refuse the surgery, you should not do this. No, absolutely no judgment. And the other thing which is very important is respect patient's decision. Now you may think it is very important for them to go undergo a surgery. They don't want to. You respect their decision, and the patient has a right to refuse a treatment only and only if he has the capacity. So this is how I break up, and this is my flow chart of you to understand that this is how you proceed with the autonomy of the patient. You have to respect the patient's decision. Then comes beneficence. So these are like autonomy, beneficence. These are like ethical principles. Beneficence means do good in simple terms. So beneficence is benefit. It means taking actions that serve the best interests of the patient and their families. So say a physician has a responsibility to recommend a life-saving transfusion or a surgery to a Jehovah's Witness. As a doctor, you have to make it available for, make all the options for the patient available on the table, that this what you can do in this scenario. That is the beneficence. And then respect patient's autonomy if he or she refuses. Non-maleficence, so this means doing no harm. Beneficence is doing good, and non-maleficence is doing no harm. So surgeons or physicians should recommend surgeries where likely benefits outweigh the known risks of a surgery. Now there is this kind of a scenario where a surgeon declines to perform a procedure because she thinks it's a high mortality surgery, or a patient is, very morbid, they have a very high cardiovascular risk, they have other comorbidities which they may not survive the procedure. So it's also like a surgeon's discretion or a physician's discretion to recommend that medical intervention regarding the patient's state. Like say if a patient is very very sick, with so many comorbidities, like bad cardiovascular health, uncontrolled diabetes, they have valve defects, and they are not fit for undergoing and not fit to undergo anesthesia. In that case, a doctor would not recommend them doing an elective procedure like a cholecystectomy, which the benefits of that are very few as compared to the patient surviving that anesthesia for a long time. So there is like a kind of a balance that a doctor has to maintain. Then comes justice. Justice means that there is an element of an absolute fairness and equality in all medical decisions. There is a respect for human rights and no discrimination on the basis of caste, color, creed, religion, sex, or race. Now we come to a very important topic, which is consent. So I've tried to fit in one topic per video, and I hope this helps. But if you want it the other way around, let me know in the comments and we'll figure that out. Coming to the topic of consent. Now in exam, say you've done like 100 questions, it's not necessary that a question on consent would come with the same language. So it's very important to understand the concept of ethics and then use it practically to attempt a question. So if you understand the basics, it's easier for you to attempt a question. Consent basically means a voluntary agreement sorry, or an autonomous authorization of a medical intervention by a patient. So this is in medical terms. The patient comes to you, they have to give a consent. If you're examining the patient, you're doing any medical procedures to the patient, that means that there is a voluntary agreement. That means this is not under force, this is not under coercion, but the patient is voluntarily agreeing to do the procedure or have a medical intervention. Now there can be various type of consents. Consents can be an implied consent. This can be by the behavior or action or words of the patient. Say a patient comes to you and you say, is it okay if I examine you? And they're like, yeah. So is an implied consent. Yes is an implied consent. That means you did not made them sign like a document per se, or it was not like sometimes when you have to vaccinate a child and you take their arm and they are okay with that, or certain scenarios like that, that is an implied consent. So if you like ask the patient, is it okay if I ask you a few questions in NACOSK exam, they say yes, that is okay, that's an implied consent. An expressed consent is a very legalized version of a consent which is mostly written. It can be oral also. Oral consent where you explain the patient and you tell them that do you understand what I am trying to tell you and they say, yes, I am understanding. Or written consent is again a written document where the patient has to read everything and then sign. So for a consent to be valid, there are certain conditions for a consent to be valid. And this is very important because this can sometimes come in a question. So for a consent to serve as a defense, if a patient sues a doctor or a hospital system, you have to have a valid consent. So for that, there are various components of that valid consent. The first is it is voluntary. It is not under force. Nobody is blackmailing the patient. It comes from the patient, by the patient, nobody else. So it's a voluntary consent. The patient must have the capacity to consent. That means the patient is capable. I will discuss the capacity of a patient in next video, but the second part is that the patient should be mentally competent to consent. And the other is it's a very specific consent. So it specific is first regarding the procedure that is going to be performed, the risks, the benefits, everything, and it is specific. It is not that you know the patient is undergoing a heart surgery and the doctor takes a consent for a heart surgery but did not take a consent for anesthesia. So it has to be a very specific consent. Also, the consent refers to who all will be doing the procedures, will the medical students will be there, residents will be there, everything else. So it's a very specific consent, which means specific in regards to the procedure, specific in regards to what all is being done and who all are doing it. And the patient must be properly informed. So everything has to be very clear and transparent to the patient. So informed consent criterias, certain criterias are that all major adverse effects should be discussed. All the consequences should be discussed with the patient if they denied the treatment. Like say they're telling the patient that okay, you need to get this tumor out of your body. The patient understands that, but you should also let them know what if the tumor is not taken out of the body, what it can do to them. So it is informed in all respects, all the consequences that can happen to the patient if the treatment is denied. uh, Sometimes it's like just a general understanding. Could you remove a tumor or a cancer without patient's consent? No, unless it's an emergency. So it's not like you like a doctor goes there, does a cholecystectomy, sees there is an ovarian tumor, and at that time he just without asking the patient, they just remove that ovarian tumor. No, because the consent was taken for a cholecystectomy surgery, not an ovarian surgery. So there is a specificity to it. Unless there is an emergency, unless there is something that was causing the symptoms of the patient and the patient's life is at risk without the removal of that thing or without that procedure being done. So some of the examples that I made up, but they do have the concept of consent in it. Now a question is, a neurosurgeon performs a cranial surgery for schwannoma on a 45-year-old musician. After a surgery following a month, neurosurgeon receives a court notice for professional negligence and battery. The problem in this case is that the surgeon never mentioned the most common side effect of the surgery was hearing loss. And this was a matter of bread and butter for the musician. So everything has to be clearly explained to the patient, and reasonable risks which are particularly relevant to a particular set of patients. So say if a person is doing a very fine motor tasks, it's a musician, it's a chef, doesn't matter what the profession, but if there is a tendon repair that is being done for a carpal tunnel syndrome and there is a loss of ulnar nerve sensation, this should be explained to a person who's doing like fine tasks with hands, and that is a critical component for their jobs. So that is important to be explained to a patient, otherwise it accounts for a battery and negligence. So, some things about informed consent that we need to understand. Patients may change their mind anytime at any process of the surgery. I mean, before undergoing the surgery, they may change anytime. Even when you are, taking them to the OR and all of a sudden they say, I do not want this surgery, they have full capacity and full capability of changing their mind. That is important thing. Informed consent is required every time except an emergency treatment is required. An unconscious patient presents with cerebral edema after a motor vehicle accident. We do not know who's the next of the kin for the patient. The patient is unconscious, so he cannot clearly consent to the surgery. So to go in and do a burr hole to relieve the tension in the brain is a life-saving procedure for this patient. So this is a condition where there is emergency treatment that is required. In that case, obviously we have nobody to give the consent. That qualifies for an emergency condition. Or there is a patient, we do not know what is their advanced directives. We do not know if they have a do not resuscitate or do not do any intervention for that patient, and they previously undergo a cardiac arrest. So in these cases, we do not have any idea, we do not know any next of kin. SDM is required, patient lacks the decision making capacity, and consent is required but by SDM. And if we do not have the SDM and we have nothing, so in this case, like MVA, we have to undergo we have to do an emergency procedure, and that is where emergency treatment is required. So minors who are not of legal age or they have no decision making capacity, now this comes, I've put two asterisks, and we will discuss the concept of emancipated minors in future videos, but that is one of the concepts that we need to keep in mind about minors. So exceptions to the consent, Toronto Notes says there are three exceptions to the consent, and one of them is the emergency, which we just discussed. So treatment without consent is allowed in emergency if the patient is suffering severely or a delay would cause serious harm or death, and neither the patient or their SDM can provide consent. So I gave you an example of a motor vehicle accident and cerebral edema. Care must not violate prior wishes. Say it's a Jehovah's Witness card. If the patient is incapable, the physician must document the incapacity and emergent nature of the situation. Patient can challenge incapacity findings. If no SDM is available, the physician may proceed without consent until SDM arrives or the emergency resolves. So the patients can challenge incapacity findings. So if there is no SDM or no substitute decision maker who's available and the patient is incapable of giving a consent, till the time SDM comes, the physicians should wait. But if the situation is so critical that we cannot wait for the SDM to come, the physician can proceed without the consent. Then there is a concept of public and mental health legislation. Mental health legislation allows for the detention of patients without their consent if they are the patients who are treated as psychiatric outpatients, who are given a care plan in accordance with community treatment orders, and also public health legislation. So this is like sometimes when the patient is a threat to public. Say the patient has sexually transmitted disease, or the patient has TB, but this patient is a community is a health hazard to community because it's a communicable disease. So we need to treat the patient even if it is against their wishes, because we do not want the community entirely to get sick and they have something which is a communicable disease. So in that case, that is required. And also for for the patients who are mentally incapable of making their decisions, that is where the doctors can proceed. But then again, the important part is SDMs or whatever the community treatment orders are there. Certain special situations, this is similar public health emergencies, which is an epidemic or communicable disease treatment warrant for information by police. So sometimes there can be situations where the administration or the law would require you to just ask that does that patient have a sexually transmitted disease or an epidemic or like something which is threat to community. In that cases we cannot withhold because it's a threat to the entire community. Then comes the age of consent. A patient, there is no particular age that okay, the patient turned 16 or 21, they can give the consent. There is no particular age and it varies by case to case. Physicians usually determine whether the child has a mental capacity, competence to provide consent on a case to case basis. So it's not like if it's a child, they cannot give the consent. Now it's a 1 year old who's scared of who's scared of vaccines, who's scared of injections. He says he doesn't want to get vaccinated. That is not counted as a consent because the child does not understand the risks versus benefits of vaccination, right? So in that case, it doesn't qualify for that valid consent thing. But say this is like a 14-year-old child or 16-year-old child who's had like a dismal prognosis or a dismal disease which has a bad outcome. Say they have a CNS tumor which has a very bad neurological outcome. They have undergone various cycles of chemo, radiation, and surgery. The tumor keeps on coming back. Now this is a child, say 14 years old, 12 years old, 16 years old, who understands that it's futile to do these treatments because they are not getting any better. The side effects of chemotherapy are way more than the benefits of doing those procedures. They may ask a doctor that, I do not want to undergo this, and that is an understandable consent. So the patient should have the ability and appreciation to understand what all is happening with them. Failing to obtain consent, this implies treatment without consent, and this qualifies for a battery, which is like no consent or non-specific or wrong consent. Say a same example that I gave you, a surgeon found an ovarian mass while operating for cholecystectomies, and these are the consequences which can qualify for a battery or a negligence. So I took this screenshot from CPSO. This is an official website of the hierarchy of SDMs. I will discuss the SDMs as substitute decision maker. I will discuss about everything regarding capacity, substitute decision makers, power of attorney in next subsequent videos. But just to give you an idea about the hierarchy. So a guard, first of all, who can take actions? First is the patient themselves. If the patient is not in the capacity to give the consent, then who all? So the first is a guardian of a person who is authorized to give or refuse consent to treatment. The second is an attorney for personal care authorized by written power of attorney document to give or refuse consent to treatment on behalf of an incapable patient. A representative appointed and authorized by the consent and capacity board to give or refuse consent to treatment. Then a spouse or partner as defined by sections of HCCA. This is like a Health Care Act of Ontario. And then there is a child or a parent, excluding a parent who only has a right of access, or an individual agency, a parent with only right of access, a sibling, any other relative, and the public guardian or and the trustee. So these are like, this is how the hierarchy goes, and we will discuss more about it. So where a patient is incapable with respect to treatment and physicians must obtain consent by SDM, this is a hierarchy that we just discussed. And for the SDM, this is the highest ranking person in that order who can give the consent. So certain things for them are, they should be capable, the SDMs or the substitute decision maker should be capable with respect to treatment, at least 16 years old, unless they are incapable person's parent, not prohibited by court order or separation agreement from having access to incapable patient or from giving or refusing consent on their behalf, available to communicate consent or refuse consent within a time that is reasonable in the circumstances, and willing to assume the responsibility of giving or refusing consent. So this also is from the CPSO website. So obtaining a legal consent, now as we discussed earlier, legal consent is usually a written consent which is preferred. It's a signed consent, and evidence of consent, it does not replace the process of obtaining a valid consent. Most important component is what patient understands and appreciates, not what the signed consent form states. So say sometimes what happens is the patient is speaking another language and the consent is written in another language. Say a patient is speaking Spanish and they only understand Spanish, but they signed a form in English. That is not a valid consent. So the patient understands and appreciates Spanish, but they signed a form in English. So that is not a consent that will be valid. Um, the other thing is implied. So again, I gave an example of patient holding out their arm for an immunization or expressed. Consent is an ongoing process and it can be withdrawn or changed after it is given, unless stopping a procedure would put the patient at risk of a serious harm and the patient is not informed of or capable of considering these harms. If the consent has been withdrawn during a procedure, the physician must stop the treatment unless stopping the procedure would threaten the patient's life. And in obtaining consent to continue the procedure, the physician need only re-explain the procedure and risks if there has been a material change in circumstances since obtaining the original consent. So the Healthcare Act of Ontario covers the consent to treatment, admission to a facility, and personal assistant services such as home care. So this is all what I had for consent. If you like this, or if you would have some suggestions on how we can go through all the material, you would want more of question answer format, or more of the text and questions like these, let me know in comments, and let me know if you have special requests for additional topics. Thank you and have a nice day.